He was just another soldier, but on that freezing winter morning in 1943, Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov would become something more. The Soviet platoon had been cut off from their main unit for 3 days. 32 men, surrounded by endless white wilderness. No radio contact, no supplies. Just snow, wind, and the constant threat of German patrols. It started simple enough, a routine reconnaissance mission into the dense forest near the Kalinin front. The temperature that morning was -22 degrees Fahrenheit, cold so intense it could freeze a man's breath before it left his mouth. Petrov knew their situation was desperate. They'd been separated during a surprise German artillery bombardment. Their maps were useless, their supply lines completely severed, and every hour made survival less likely. The first night was the hardest. They huddled in an abandoned farmhouse, its wooden walls offering minimal protection against the brutal Russian winter. Vladimir Kozlov, their youngest soldier, just 19 years old, was shivering uncontrollably. The older soldiers knew what that meant. Hypothermia was coming. Sergei Laikov, a veteran of 2 previous campaigns, started gathering whatever wood they could find. They broke apart old furniture, burned anything that might generate heat. The risk of a fire attracting German attention was real, but freezing to death was a more immediate threat. By midnight their situation looked grim. 27 of the original 32 men remained conscious. 2 had already fallen into deep, dangerous sleeps from which they wouldn't wake. Another was badly wounded from shrapnel during the initial bombardment. Lieutenant Petrov made a critical decision. They would move at first light. Staying meant certain death. Moving meant a chance, even a slim one, of finding their unit or a friendly position. Dawn broke cold and silent. The landscape was a blank canvas of white, broken only by dark tree lines and the occasional distant hill. No movement, no sound. Just bitter, crushing cold. They moved in a tight formation, wounded men supported by stronger soldiers, their boots crunching through deep snow. Every step was an effort, every breath a struggle against the freezing air. By noon they'd covered maybe 3 kilometers. Their water was frozen. Their food supplies were down to emergency rations, dried bread, and a few strips of salted meat. Morale was dropping with each painful step. Then something changed. A German patrol, maybe 500 meters away. The soldiers went completely still. One wrong move would reveal their position. One sound could mean death. Petrov signaled silently. They would hide. They would wait. The next 6 hours were the longest of their lives. German soldiers moved through the forest, their white camouflage making them almost invisible against the snow. One wrong breath. One accidental movement. Discovery meant certain execution, but they survived. By nightfall they had evaded detection, but they were exhausted, hungry, freezing. Their story wasn't over. Not yet. Subscribe for more. The next shelter was a small depression in a rocky hillside, partially hidden by a fallen pine tree. Petrov assessed their condition quickly. Vladimir was getting weaker. The shrapnel-wounded soldier, Dmitry Lokov, was developing an infection that they had no antibiotics to treat. Sergei Lokov pulled out a small flask, something he'd been saving for a moment of true desperation. It was disc, not for drinking, but for cleaning Lokov's wound. The alcohol would have to serve as their only medicine. As Sergei cleaned the wound, Lokov gritted his teeth. His face was pale, sweat beading, despite the freezing temperature. The wound was deep, the shrapnel having torn through muscle and likely nicked something internal. They all knew the risks. Night was falling again. The temperature would drop even further. Lieutenant Petrov pulled out their remaining maps, studying them by the dim light of a small, carefully shielded lantern. They were far off their original route, miles from any known Russian positions. The German lines could be anywhere. Their radio had been damaged during the initial bombardment. Communication was impossible. Vladimir mumbled something in his sleep. Fever was setting in. The young soldiers' chances were diminishing with each passing hour. Sergei shared a look with Petrov. They'd seen this before, young soldiers who couldn't make it, who would become a burden to the group's survival. But this was Vladimir, the boy who had lied about his age to join the unit, who had a mother waiting for him in a small village outside Moscow, who had dreams of becoming a teacher after the war. They would not leave him behind. The night passed in painful increments, taking turns keeping watch, sharing body heat, rationing their last food supplies. By morning 3 more men showed signs of severe exhaustion. Their bodies were shutting down, fighting against the relentless cold. Petrov knew they needed to find shelter, find help, find something, but the landscape offered nothing. Nothing but white, nothing but silence. They moved slowly, supporting each other. Vladimir semi-conscious, carried between 2 stronger soldiers. Dmitry Lyrkov bleeding intermittently, his wound not fully sealed. The terrain became more challenging. Rocky hills, dense pine forests, areas where snow concealed potential dangers, hidden streams, unstable ground, unexpected drops. Each step was a negotiation with survival itself. By midday they heard something, distant, almost imperceptible. Engine sounds. Not German, not Russian. Something else. Petrov raised his hand. Complete silence. The sound grew closer, mechanical, rhythmic. Then they saw it. Not a military vehicle. A farm tractor. Old, clearly civilian, moving slowly through a distant field. The implications hit them simultaneously. Civilians, potential help, potential danger. In war, nothing was simple. A friendly farmer could just as easily report them to German forces as offer assistance. But they were out of options. Petrov made the decision. They would approach, carefully. The tractor belonged to an old man, Nikolai Petrovich, a farmer who had refused to leave his land despite the war raging around him. When he saw the group of soldiers, half frozen, wounded, desperate, he didn't hesitate. "Get in," he said simply. The next few hours would change everything. Nikolai's farmhouse was small but sturdy, built from thick logs that had weathered generations of Russian winters. The interior was warm, heated by an ancient cast-iron stove that radiated a life-saving heat. He moved quickly, efficiently, despite his age. A weathered man in his 70s with hands that told stories of decades of farm work. Vladimir was laid down first, his body barely responding. Sergei helped Dmitry, whose wound continued to seep blood through hastily applied bandages. Petrov remained alert, his soldier's instincts never fully relaxing, even in this moment of apparent safety. Nikolai moved with purposeful precision. Hot tea first as strong and dark, mixed with something herbal that smelled medicinal. He cut strips of clean cloth, boiled water, prepared what looked like a traditional healing mixture that seemed part medicine, part folk remedy. "German patrols come through here sometimes," Nikolai said, not looking up from his work. "But they leave me alone. I'm just an old farmer." His statement hung in the air, part truth, part something else. Petrov studied him carefully. An old farmer who seemed very well prepared, who moved with a surprising confidence, whose eyes held more than simple agricultural wisdom. The farmhouse contained subtle signs of complexity, military maps carefully folded and hidden behind a cabinet, a radio receiver partially concealed beneath some folded blankets, hunting rifles that looked well maintained, not just tools for occasional game hunting. Dmitry's wound needed serious attention. The bullet had entered near his shoulder, creating a channel that was dangerously close to critical blood vessels. Nikolai's hands worked with a surgeon's precision, cleaning, probing, applying a sequence of treatments that suggested more than simple farm knowledge. "You were with the 42nd Rifle Division," Nikolai stated, not asked. His eyes met Petrov's, a challenge and a statement of fact. Petrov didn't confirm or deny. Military protocol ran deep, even here. The old farmer chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "I was reconnaissance, Moscow Military District. Before the war changed everything." This explained the maps, the radio, the precise medical knowledge. Outside the snow continued, a relentless white landscape that seemed to swallow sound, movement, history itself. The farmhouse felt like a small pocket of resistance against the overwhelming whiteness. Vladimir's fever broke slowly, his breathing became more regular. The youngest soldier mumbled occasionally, fragments of conversations, memories of home, dreams interrupted by war's harsh realities. Nikolai prepared food, simple but substantial, thick bread, salted meat preserved from autumn's preparations, boiled root vegetables that spoke of careful rationing, of survival strategies developed over years of hardship. "The Germans came through here last month," he said casually, while stirring a pot. "Searched everything, looking for partisans, looking for radio transmitters." Sergei tensed. Petrov's hand unconsciously moved toward his sidearm. Nikolai didn't seem to notice their reaction. Or perhaps he noticed everything. "They found nothing," he continued, "because there was nothing to find." The statement hung in the air, loaded, ambiguous. As night fell, the farmhouse became a sanctuary, wounded soldiers sleeping, an old former reconnaissance officer maintaining watch. The war existed outside, a distant thunderstorm waiting to break. But something was brewing, something that Nikolai Petrovich knew and was carefully, methodically preparing for. The night deepened. Snow continued falling. Silence reigned, punctuated only by occasional soft breathing, the crackling of the stove, the subtle sounds of a farmhouse holding its secrets close. The first hint of dawn brought a change. Petrov awoke first, his military instincts cutting through the farmhouse's stillness. Nikolai was already dressed, standing by the window, watching something in the distance. "German reconnaissance," he said without turning. "About 12 kilometers east, moving slow." Sergei and Vladimir were still asleep. Dmitri's wound looked better, the bandages clean, the inflammation reduced. Nikolai moved with a practiced efficiency. He pulled out a map, tracing potential German movement routes with a weathered finger. Each mark suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain, of tactical positioning. "We cannot stay here," Petrov said. "It wasn't a suggestion." Nikolai nodded. "I have a cellar, underground passage. Connects to an old hunting trail." Within 30 minutes they were moving. Vladimir was weak but mobile. Dmitri was supported between Sergei and Petrov. Nikolai carried their minimal supplies, moving with a silence that suggested decades of survival training. The underground passage was remarkable. Reinforced wooden walls, carefully placed support beams, ventilation points carefully concealed. It spoke of deliberate long-term preparation. "How long have you been ready?" Petrov asked. Nikolai's smile was thin. "Since 1941, when they first came." The passage wound through rocky terrain, occasionally rising to allow brief visual checks. Twice they heard distant German vehicle movements. Each time Nikolai signaled absolute stillness. By midday they emerged kilometers from the original farmhouse. A small cached supply point contained additional medical supplies, weapons and winter clothing. "Who are you?" Sergei finally asked. Nikolai's response was cryptic. "Someone who remembers, someone who prepares." The next 3 days were a careful experience, avoiding main roads, using hidden trails. Vladimir's condition stabilized. Dmitri's wound continued healing under Nikolai's precise medical care. On the 4th day they reached a Soviet partisan communication point. Nikolai was known here, respected, acknowledged with quiet nods of recognition. Their intelligence report would be significant. German troop movements, defensive line vulnerabilities, strategic observations gathered during their dangerous experience. As they prepared to separate, Nikolai gave each soldier a small sealed packet, medical supplies, emergency rations, precise survival instructions. "The war is not just fought with bullets," he said. "It is survived with preparation, with knowledge." Petrov understood. This was more than a rescue. This was a transmission of survival wisdom. Nikolai disappeared into the forest as quietly as he had emerged. No dramatic farewell, no extended goodbyes, just gone. The official record would show 4 Soviet soldiers rescued, one mysterious local farmer assisting their escape. Nothing more. But the real story was far more complex. A network of resistance, of preparation, of quiet persistent survival against overwhelming odds. In 1944 the tide was turning, but survival remained a daily negotiation between skill, luck and unyielding human determination. More stories coming soon. The war's invisible heroes were men like Nikolai Dmitri, strategic, patient, prepared. Their resistance wasn't just about combat, but preservation. Preservation of hope, of homeland, of human dignity. Years later, Soviet archives would partially reveal fragments of these underground networks. Nikolai was one codename among 100 Mirza resistance fighters who transformed simple farmhouses, cellars, and forest trails into complex survival infrastructure. In 1947, 2 years after the war's conclusion, Sergei would learn Nikolai's full identity, a former NKVD intelligence officer named Konstantin Nikov, who had been establishing resistance networks since 1939, anticipating the German invasion. His preparations saved hundreds of Soviet soldiers, providing escape routes, medical support, and critical intelligence. Vladimir recovered fully, eventually becoming a military historian. Dmitry returned to his engineering work in Moscow. Petrov continued serving, rising to senior military leadership. Each carried the lessons of that winter map preparation, adaptability, quiet resilience. The landscape they traversed, those dense forests between Belarus and Ukraine, held countless untold stories. Generations would pass before the full complexity of wartime survival would be understood. Not just battles and heroics, but the intricate human networks that sustained resistance. Nikolai Sporis Konstantin never sought recognition. His work was about survival, not glory. When Soviet authorities eventually traced his wartime activities, they were stunned by the scale and precision of his underground network. Multiple small groups, carefully trained, carefully positioned, communication lines that operated with near-invisible precision, a living, breathing resistance organism that predated official military strategies. By 1950, most of these networks had been systematically documented, then deliberately obscured, too complex, too subtle for simple propaganda narratives. What remained were personal memories, whispered stories passed between veterans. Nikolai represented that capacity, not as a mythical hero, but as a practical, methodical survivor who understood that true resistance was about sustained preparation, not just momentary heroics. His legacy wasn't in medals or official records, but in the lives saved, in the knowledge transmitted, in the quiet determination that defined an entire generation's struggle. The forest kept its secrets. The trails remained silent witnesses. More stories coming soon.